My name is Eleanor Grace Hartman. I'm 32 years old, and I live in a small apartment above a laundromat in Brooklyn. For most of my childhood I moved through rooms the way a gust of wind moves through curtains, noticed only when the drapes were stirred. Clean, I answer. I keep my head down. Right now my life is a patchwork of night shifts at a hospital, a plant on my windowsill that won't die, and a shoebox of letters I have never opened. Emotionally, I'm frayed and watchful. I measure people by their small mercies. I trust very slowly. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. I don't tell this kind of thing lightly, but maybe my truth will mean something to someone who needs to hear it. The first memory of being invisible is the cinnamon-scented morning my father failed to wake me for school. He was already dressed in the thin gray uniform his boss gave him. Pressed shirt, badge clipped just so, and his hands smelled of lemon and industrial cleaner. My mother stood at the kitchen table, counting bills with eyes that never found me. I had scraped my knee the night before. Tissue and sympathy were luxuries reserved for the polished floors and potted orchids in the office upstairs, and I went to school barefoot because I'd been told to save shoes for real people. Our apartment smelled of boiled cabbage, old laundry, and the faint metallic tang of cleaning solutions. Outside, the streetcars rattled, the air heavy with hot summer heat that made the asphalt shimmer like glass. Inside, the radio hummed low, my mother's voice in the background, American pop songs muffled through the thin walls, but none directed at me. When I asked for a bandage, my father glanced up as if I were an insect he might flick away. "You'll be fine, Ellie," he said. "It's just skin." What they called just skin was an altar of quiet things I learned to perform without show. Swallowing shame, turning my cheek, making small apologies for existing. My parents, Marta and Luis, worked for Henry Whitcomb, the man who owned more of our city than any map could show. Whitcomb's building scraped the clouds and held elevators that smelled like money. He was the kind of man whose name was printed on museum wings, whose yachts had names carved with calligraphy. To him my parents were reliable hands and a family narrative that was always kept tidy and, above all, private. You should understand the rhythm of our life. We lived in the margins of someone else's grandeur. My parents would leave the apartment before dawn, slipping like ghosts into the glass doors of Whitcomb's palazzo. I would stay behind, pretending to sleep until they returned with their uniforms still smelling faintly of polish and something floral that came from Mrs. Whitcomb's perfume. They brought home more than money. Stories filtered through the sieve of discretion. "He is a good man," my mother would rehearse, like a prayer she said to have sleep. But good, for my parents, looked like a number on a check and a promise that whatever they endured would keep us fed. And inside that bargain I became the thing to hide. When Whitcomb's daughter, elegant, taught to smile like a photograph, hosted garden parties, my parents left me at home to sleep on a pull-out couch behind a curtain while the house above filled with laughter and artists smirking at champagne. When guests came and asked about the help, my mother would smooth her apron, lower her voice and say, "We don't have family in the city." That was their script, a way to keep their employment and their dignity in a world that measured both by proximity to wealth. One evening when I was 10, I opened a wardrobe in the back room and found a wrapped box of children's clothes in size that matched me. I remember the fabric. Soft cotton, mercerized, a smell of cedar that suggested it had been stored and forgotten in a house with climate control. My fingers traced the hems until my chest ached. I took one sleeve and held it to my face, inhaling as if I could fix the distance between me and some person who decided I didn't belong. When my mother found me, she didn't scold. She simply stood there, her jaw tight. "Don't touch that," she hissed. The warning was only for the wardrobe. I learned where I could touch affection and where I was required to abstain. There were rules to be obeyed like them, apologies to be offered before breakfast. I learned at an early age that my parents' survival required me to be smaller, quieter, less demanding. They did not mean to make me nothing. They were tired. They bore their humiliation with a stoicism that I admired and learned to mimic. But imitation becomes instruction, and I grew into the child who asked for permission to exist. At school, classmates would trade stories about weekends at their grandmother's houses, about gardens and beaches and movies. I had afternoons full of thrift store books and the neighbor's stray cat for company. I learned to interpret the world through the sounds of Mr. Whitcomb's car horn echoing down the block as he left for office, and through the stories my mother would whisper. We must be careful. You never know what the world will do to people who are careless. It was a sin to be careless where they worked. The humiliation changed me in the way water changes stone, slowly carving out hollows. I watched parents at school pick up their children and feel a pang like a foreign object. Jealousy, a hollow ache for a life with backward angles and soft light. At home, my parents didn't talk about my school reports. They asked about whether I had learned to iron properly, whether I'd mastered the right way to fold sheets to avoid creases that offended the Whitcombs. The only praise I received was for practical skill. A sweater mended, a stain removed, a silence maintained. There was one night when the boundaries snapped. I was 16. My father came home late. The city had been hit by a storm and the Whitcombs had a dinner party to salvage. Matters of optics that did not accept rain. He smelled of the cold, of wet wool and the metal tang of stress. I was folding napkins, a chore that had become ritual, and my mother's face was a map of worry. Did you see the news? My father asked, tossing his keys on the counter. The television in the corner of the kitchen murmured with the anchor's voice. Power outage downtown. The elevator at Whitcomb's got stuck. There were people, celebrity people, stuck for hours. Can't have that. You know how Henry gets. Something in him broke open then. An exhausted, brittle candor. He looked at me as if he had the option to notice me, and he did. You're useless sometimes, Ellie, he said like a verdict. What good is being loud or smart if it doesn't buy you a clean pillow at night? The words weren't new, but the heat in them was. I felt my chest tighten, my palms went damp. Tears gathered like rain under my eyelids, and I let them fall because I had nowhere else to put them. My mother placed a hand on my shoulder, not in comfort but as if to steady a porcelain figure so it wouldn't shatter in front of the employers. Stop, she murmured but softly, more like a door closing on my smallness. I left the apartment that night, barefoot on the wet pavement, my sneakers left by the door. The city felt excessive and indifferent. Lying on the stoop of an all-night deli, I watched a limousine glide by with lights like stars and thought of the rooms my parents cleaned and the dinners they set and never sat at. I thought, with a sudden, fierce clarity, that if I was nothing to them, then I would have to become something for myself. That decision was the first step I took toward leaving, the first breath I took with someone else's oxygen. I applied for scholarships and filled out job applications and, mostly I read. Books borrowed from the school library, words that wrapped around me like a coat. At night, when loneliness gnawed, I would whisper to myself the small affirmation that my parents never gave me. You deserve air. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. You have no idea how much it means to hear that someone else is listening. But the thing about making that choice, about leaving the shape your parents carved for you, is that it's not something that absolves anyone of the past. You carry the pieces of it like luggage on a train. You learn to pack them differently. The city can be especially cruel to those who carry old wounds. I found work as a nursing aide at a community hospital. That's where bands of fluorescent lights and the reek of antiseptic became the new soundtrack of my life. I learned to listen to the small sounds of bodies. The shallow, mechanical breath of sleep, the tiny, frightened noises before anesthesia, the exhale of someone letting go. The work was humbling and honest. It asked nothing of me except presence. It also gave me a name that didn't require permission. At night, when I folded the hospital linens with a care that made me proud, I would sometimes think about the Whitcomb house. How my parents straightened silverware, how they slicked napkins with an extra crease to please, and how their loyalty had been a currency no one declared. The world above them had everything and the world below them had endurance. If I had one secret ambition, it was to someday enter the Whitcomb mansion not as someone whose hands shook with fear, but as a woman who bore her own worth like a badge. That's how it stood for years. Me gathering my dignity quietly. My parents dutiful and fractured. The Whitcomb name like a shadow over our lives. I ran through shifts, through classes, through rented rooms. The humiliation never left entirely, but neither did the stubbornness that taught me to keep moving. And then, one winter night, Henry Whitcomb's car slid off the bridge. I remember the call like an alarm. The dispatcher said there had been a collision, that a high-profile individual was en route, and to prepare a trauma bay. My hands started working before my mind did, the way a muscle remembers a song. I scrubbed in with a hollow hope lodged in my throat, that nothing could change me, that this would be a passing storm. But sometimes storms don't pass. They rearrange the furniture of your life. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. I promise I'll keep this honest. They brought him in on a gurney, the kind of man whose presence cleaved the room in half, sirens in his wake, a hush that fell like velvet. I scrubbed at my station with motions so practiced they were almost automatic. Glove on, mask tied, the metallic clink of instruments. The trauma team moved like a well-rehearsed orchestra. Someone called his name, which I didn't recognize initially. Henry Whitcomb. I had seen his face before. A portrait in the lobby of a museum, a clip on a news segment, but up close, stitched to the gurney and slick with blood. He was like everyone else, human and fragile. His skin smelled faintly of cologne and gasoline. His breathing came in a way that suggested the body was struggling to decide whether to keep fighting. "Get a line," the attending barked. "Fast blood, 2 units. Fully. Intubation prep." My trained hands moved into the choreography. Start the 4 in his arm, steady the line. He was unconscious, but his hands, richly manicured, were trembling. There was a bruise forming on his temple, a dark comet. When we lifted his eyelids to check the pupils, I felt something in my chest constrict, not out of respect for his name but out of recognition. The gloves I was wearing rubbed against the skin of a man whose house my parents had scrubbed for decades. The realization slammed into me with the force of cold water. "Are we clear?" someone asked. My voice answered without my permission. "Clear," I said. It wasn't the same as saying the word had meant when my parents used it. No, this was different. This clear was a small miracle we prize in medicine. No hemorrhage, no immediate brain swelling. As we worked, the nurse to my right, a woman named Gloria who'd been at the hospital longer than some marriages last, whispered, "You know who this is? The Whitcomb. His people will be here in a flash. Be ready." I felt my throat constrict. My hands were steady, my training a liturgy. But then, amid the sterile hum of monitors, the smell of alcohol swab and antiseptic, I caught sight of a photograph clipped to the inside of his wallet. An old Polaroid of a woman with dark hair and a clever tired smile. A little hand curled up against the woman's skirt. The little hand looked like mine. When the family arrived, well-dressed, stunned into a strange, pristine grief, I was informed through the chain of people that I should represent. A PR liaison hovered like an anxious vulture. Henry's son, a man built reliably like the man I knew from photos, sat with hands in his lap, light tapping like a metronome. Fast, I could have told you then that I would never expect gratitude. Nurses don't operate on the currency of thanks. We stitch and hold and leave without the grand applause. But gratitude sometimes arrives the shape of a look, an unanticipated softness. The thing that followed that night was not what I'd imagined. A week later, Mr. Whitcomb woke up. He was like a foreign king in a private room. His face shadowed and his eyes bewildered. The family released statements. Directors of foundations issued measured concern. The hospital corridor outside his suite smelled of lilies arranged by servants who seemed to move like the house staff back at his mansion. Smooth, quiet, practiced. I passed his room on my rounds because trauma cases require constant watching, and there he was, awake, small in a room built to cradle him, wrapped in the fragile dignity of survival. He stared at the ceiling for a long while like a man recalibrating his coordinates. I used to imagine what he might think about in a room like that. Will, investments, 1,000 small irritations. But when he saw me, a nurse he had never met, his eyes steadied and there was a kind of recognition that was almost animal. He turned and, against protocol, he pulled on his bed and lifted his legs. A nurse tried to stop him. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said. "You shouldn't." He looked at her and then at me, a look that carried a weight I couldn't yet measure. The next thing he did is the kind of thing stories invent because the human heart sometimes insists on moral spectacle. He reached for her hand, and at first it was a small, tremulous gesture. Then, with a clarity that stopped the breath in everyone who saw it, he lowered himself to his knees beside the bed. "Please," he said. The room cracked open. "Not for me." For a moment no one moved. His knees were thin against the hospital blanket, the carpet of the room making a soundlessly embarrassing creak. My stomach flipped in a way I hadn't expected. Confusion, suspicion, a mourning for something I had not yet been allowed to name. He looked up at me. "I need to tell her the truth," he said. His voice was ragged, like paper being torn slow and loud. "If I don't, I'll carry it with me." The nurse to my left swallowed. "Sir, family protocol." "My family can wait," he said. He was staring at me as if I'd been a mirror. And something else, a memory I think, crossed his face. For a scattering of seconds he was not the tycoon who named wards and gave donations. He was a man who had once made a choice he had buried. My feet were rooted. My hands twitched, unused to the idea of being central in someone else's reckoning. I had spent years learning to be small, to fold myself into the seams of other people's needs. And now, in a fluorescent-lit room with a city's siren song dimmed to a distant throb, a man billions had been built around was kneeling and offering something raw and unguarded. "Tell me," I said. Felt like a poor, inadequate command. Yet he told me anyway. He told me about a night many years ago, when he had been younger and reckless in ways that had cost him a life he didn't even know he'd started. He told me about a woman with dark hair, one he said he'd loved in a way that had been both tender and terrible. He told me about a child he had never known until the hospital room smelled of antiseptic and my hands had seen to his arteries. He said words like "I didn't know" and "I'm sorry" in a voice like glass, and when he said the name my bones recognized, Eleanor, someone in the room made a sound as though grief had been unlatched. My parents' faces were impossible to read when the call went out. That night, after the visitors left, they sat in our kitchen and the radio in the corner whispered like an accomplice. There was a hush not of comfort but of calculation. Louis's hands shook when he poured coffee. "You shouldn't have told them," my mother hissed. "We told you." He had the right, my father said, but he sounded distant, like a man reading someone else's lines. The words were a small battle that the years had set up. My parents had kept secrets because sometimes secrecy is a currency that buys a roof. But secrets are also weight. When I confronted them, it cracked open a surface that had been lacquered for decades. "Why did you hide it?" I asked. Not softly. The house had the smell of linens, a scent I had associated with invisibility. My mother looked at her fingers as if they spoke better than her mouth. "We were afraid," she said. "We were afraid of losing what we needed. Henry provided for us. In 1,000 little ways." He stopped. My father stared at the table as if it might fold and reveal another truth. "But you called me nothing for it," I said. "You called me less for the very thing that belonged to him." It was then that I realized their safety and my erasure had been purchased with the price of my identity. They had protected their employment by keeping the possibility of my relation to the Whitcombs a secret, an unspoken scapegoat that made me small so they could be big enough in the rooms they cleaned. The realization didn't break me all at once. It was a slow erosion, more teeth stuck in under the margin of a storm surge. I felt betrayed, yes, but also becalmed by a deep, unavoidable grief. The news spread like weather. The papers smelled of ink and old money. For the first time in my life, strangers offered me pity or congratulations, both of which felt foreign. Mr. Whitcomb, who had the world at his discretion, had kneeled in a hospital and asked me to hear a truth. The city, which had watched my parents bend and smooth, watched this new configuration of our family and tried to place it in a neat column of right and wrong. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything, I whispered later, because saying the word alone makes it less lonely. But the kneeling was only the beginning. There are things money can buy: therapists, privacy, legal counsel, and there are things it cannot: a child's surety that their parents' love is not negotiable. The moment Henry Whitcomb dropped to his knees, he reopened a wound my parents had done their best to stitch. They had treated me like nothing to survive, and now his acknowledgement of me as something other, something of him, forced them to reckon with the small cruelties they had used as armor. That reckoning would not be neat. It would not be cathartic television. It would be messy and human and sometimes unbearable. But it would also be the first time in my life so many of the adults closest to me were made to look small in the full light, some of them willingly, some of them by accident. And for the first time I had to decide if my worth was something I would accept because a billionaire knelt, or because I had been breathing long enough to claim its right. When Henry Whitcomb asked for me, it was not a private summons but something that carried all the awkward choreography of power meeting something it had overlooked. His publicists insisted on a meeting that would be labeled as reconciliation in the papers, and the hospital rooms turned into a stage where apologies could be rehearsed. My parents wanted me to accept the arrangement with as little noise as possible. I wanted to throttle the neatness of any photo op. The Whitcomb estate is the kind of place that seems built to make you forget your feet on the ground. Marble floors, imported rugs that felt like small winters underfoot, a conservatory that smelled of soil and old money. I walked through its halls with the odd sensation of being both an intruder and, incredulously, some kind of relic. The staff moved with trained lack of curiosity, and at the door the housekeeper who had supervised my parents when they worked there offered me her hand and said, "You look like your mother." The meeting was arranged in a room that would have been described in the press as intimate. In the center, Henry sat in a chair like someone who had been reshaped by the exigencies of apology and survival. He was smaller without the armor of his usual suits, his hair more silver at the temples. The son, Christopher, hovered with politeness like a man guarding a fragile plant. My parents waited a few feet behind me, shoulders tight and scared as children. The air smelled of coffee and orange peel because someone thought the prop would soften the edges. "Thank you for coming," Henry said, and the gratitude in his voice was a kind that startled me. Not because I wanted it, but because it seemed to insist on being paid for with something raw. He had a stack of papers beside him. Medical forms, statements, perhaps legal dispatches, and when he looked at me, for a second I saw something like remorse. "I didn't kneel for publicity," he said suddenly, and the honesty of it landed like a stone. "I kneel for the absence I felt when I woke up in the dark and realized there were pieces of my life I had not been brave enough to know." It sounded grandiose, as if it belonged to a man who had always been good at monuments rather than at cleaning the small things. But then he reached into the stack of papers and produced something else. An envelope, worn at the edges, addressed in a hand that trembled because hands do when memory becomes speech. "I found this after the accident," he said. "I don't know how it was in my things. I think perhaps someone put it there years ago and assumed I would keep it hidden. It belonged to your mother." My mother made a sound like a kitchen pot falling. Her face conceded away like a tide. The envelope had a photograph inside, a different one than before, this time of a young Henry and a young Marta, laughing at some small joke. The little hand of a child curled at Marta's skirt, and in the corner someone had scribbled a date. Everything we had practiced not to be in public flooded out of me. Anger, shame, longing. Henry had continued speaking, softer now. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he said. "I don't want to buy absolution with donations. I want the truth to be spoken." He leaned forward, hands clasped, as if the act of being vulnerable required a physical posture. "I want you to know I will be accountable for whatever harm I can heal." There are moments when power meets vulnerability and both feel strangely incorrect. When rich men grovel, it can be theater. When apologies have bank accounts behind them, they can sting like a gift that insists you accept a debt. I sat with the weight of it and thought of my parents, of the quiet calculus that had told them to shrink me in order to survive. How much of their smallness had been strategy and how much had been fear? I felt both the warmth of someone finally naming me and the chill of being used as someone else's penance. "I didn't ask for this," I said, and my voice sounded like a wire being plucked. I didn't ask to be a symbol. Henry's eyes met mine as if he wanted to understand. I know, he said. But I also know something else. I know that if a man like me can kneel and admit his error, then perhaps you and your family deserve the kind of reckoning that is honest and not performative. I'm offering to fund therapy for your family. I will ensure your parents have retirement savings. I will not buy your silence, but I can make space for the life they were denied. My father's shoulders sagged. My mother hid her face in her hands. The offer was practical, deadly in its logic, a moneyed solution to trauma. Part of me wanted to throw the envelope against the marble and scream until the sound joined the chimes in the hall. Another part, raw and human, felt a strange, almost allergic relief. A chance, finally, for my parents to not have to crouch beneath the weight of income insecurity. Why now? He asked. Why when you could have done anything years ago? He looked away. Because sometimes it takes being stripped of everything for a man to count what's left. I was given a second chance, and I intend to make it mean something. We negotiated like people trying to avoid a gash splitting a grain of wood. Lawyers, social workers, trustees. They wanted my permission to verify lineage, to make legal amends. The son, Christopher, watched with an expression that read like a man trying to remember how to be human. Somewhere in the middle of the legalese came a quieter exchange. My parents asking Henry in halting, broken sentences why they had to keep the secret, why the house required them to lie. It was practical, Henry muttered, as if practicality could be invoked as an ethical defense. We insisted on discretion. Jobs were at stake. Families were preserved, not because the truth wasn't important, but because there was an economy to protect. That line, an economy to protect, lodged in me like a splinter. It convinced me that their choices were transactional, that their loyalty to income was sometimes stronger than their loyalty to me. But there were deeper currents: fear of poverty, of deportation, of social ruin. My parents were not monsters. They were people who had been pressed into small decisions by a system that valued their labor more than their humanity. The first time Henry's largesse took a concrete form was clumsy and human. He sent a check for a year of back pay to my parents, delivered by a courier who refused to look at us. He also arranged for therapy sessions with a therapist from the institution he funded, a small mercy that felt both helpful and invasive. My mother sat in the first session and cried so hard she couldn't speak. My father stared at the books on the shelf and made jokes that were brittle as icicles. I watched them and wanted to grab them, to shake them until they admitted how much they had been hurting. There was another, stranger consequence to Henry's attention. He asked me to visit his office, not as a supplicant, but as someone he said he wanted to get to know beyond the incident. The idea made me cringe. I thought of my old, smaller self-folding sheets, of being called useful. I wondered why his curiosity felt like a trap. When I finally agreed, it was not because I wanted to be his daughter in the easy fairy tale sense. It was because I wanted the truth to be spoken in a place that could not be edited by polite diplomats. He wanted to talk about the past and, more importantly, about my future. He offered to sponsor my education, to fund a program that would allow me to become a nurse practitioner and to take control of my life in ways my parents had never been afforded. I cannot give you back the years your parents protected, he said, leaning forward with that old, almost feral earnestness. But I can provide a runway. Runway. The word was as clinical as the IVs he had needed. Sounded generous. Sounded like a gift. It also sounded like a new bargain. Though his gestures were large, they were still gestures, and I had learned the wary skill of accepting help without losing myself. There is a fine difference between being grateful and being beholden. I wanted to know if his actions were rooted in responsibility or in a need to assuage his conscience. When he asked me to be present at a fundraiser where he would make a very public apology to the families who worked for him, I almost refused. I am not a fan of spectacle, but perhaps because I had been small for so long, or because I wanted to see the chain of causality unhooked, I went. The night would be the first time in my life that my parents stood in a place where the lights were not directed at them, but at the man who had benefited from their submission. The gala was smooth and polished, White wine, quiet music, a speech that had been curated by half a dozen speechwriters. When Henry took the stage, his voice cracked in places but carried the weight of contrition. "I should have known," he said. "I should have asked. I should have done better." When he waved toward me and called me by name, the room hummed like a hive struck with lightning. It was in that hum I saw my parents close their eyes and, for once, not because they were searching for instructions. They were listening. That night, when we left the palace and walked out into a city that smelled of rain, something inside me had shifted. The shame was not cured, not by apology, not by money. But the facts had been spoken aloud. That, for the first time in my life, was enough to begin the work of changing how I moved in the world. If you're still with me, thank you. Means more than I can say. If this is resonating, tell someone you know. Small gestures help us carry hard stories. What followed was not linear. There was a series of afternoons that felt like post-operative care for a family that had been split open. Therapy, awkward dinners where everyone tried to relearn how to speak without rehearsing for an audience, lawyers who pried at old wounds with a practiced efficiency. Henry's money built programs and planted scholarships and paid for things that meant longevity and safety for my parents. But money does not mend the intimate geometry of a household overnight. My mother, in private, seethed and softened in turns. She found herself slipping into habits, making coffee for a roomful of guests, straightening floral arrangements, performing the composure she thought would be praised. Once, when she thought the house was empty, she called me and said, in a voice that had been stripped of the performance she perfected for Henry's world, "I am sorry for what I made you feel." Her apology landed like a wet blanket, warm, but not enough to dry the places it had touched. My father had trouble looking at me for months. His pride was a stubborn instrument, something he had used to keep the edges of his dignity intact. He loved the job that had kept us clothed and fed, and he loved the quiet of being able to say, "We are fine," without explaining the cost. When we finally sat down, it was like two people trying to learn to speak a new language after years of silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked again because asking was an ache I could not stop asking. "I thought we were protecting you," he said. "We thought the world would take more if we gave it a reason. We thought." His voice croaked. "We were wrong." It is easy to conflate pain with malice, but the truth is almost always more complicated. My parents made choices from a set of possibilities that were themselves limited. They chose jobs that demanded assimilation and discretion. They chose silence to save themselves from the consequences of being visible. Their choices cost me early childhood tenderness. My anger was valid and, over time, productive. However, anger alone does not build a future. In the months after the gala, I found myself confronting another force. The seductive power of Henry's attention. He wanted to know me beyond the ceremony. He wanted to invest in programs and fund scholarships for children of the people who worked for him. He wanted to stand publicly and say, "I failed you." He wanted to shape the narrative of atonement. I had been trained to watch for motives and to evaluate them with a clinician's skepticism. Not every act of kindness is a virtue, and not every apology is repentant. But nor is every wealthy hand offered in restitution merely a way to buy back a conscience. The nuance made me dizzy because the city taught me to reduce moral questions to transactional ones. In private, Henry was persistent, oddly gentle. He invited me to sit in rooms where decisions were made and to speak about what real change looked like. "You don't have to forgive me," he told me once. His voice a paper-thin thing in a thicker room. "I just want to spend the rest of my life making sure other people don't have to live the way you did." The honesty in him, his willingness to be frightened by his shortcomings, tugged at something in me. Not love, that's too tidy a word. I felt instead a complicated pity and a furious desire to hold him accountable for the extent of his influence. The temptation to use his resources to shore up my family's future was constant. There were scholarship offers, a job at one of his foundations, access to medical programs. There was also the small, prickly feeling of being beholden to an apology that had come too late. While the negotiations unfolded, both publicly and in the private tangle of lawyers and therapists, my relationship with my parents shifted. We started therapy as a trio. At first, the sessions were restrained, polite, like diplomatic talks after a war. We took turns speaking and listening. My mother cried more than anyone, her stoicism melting into a sob that was, finally, allowed space. My father, who had steeled himself for decades, began to talk about the nights he lay awake, fingers pressed against the fabric of a pillow, imagining a life where he'd been brave enough to admit something he had hidden. In one session, my mother reached across the coffee table and touched my hand without asking. The gesture was small and enormous. "I am so sorry," she said. "I wanted you to be safe. I thought safety was silence." And so the slow work of healing began. There were regressions, moments where my father would slip into old habits, where my mother would apologize too much to strangers. There was also a brightness. My parents, for the first time, started to speak about their own wants. My father enrolled in community college courses he had always dreamt about but never had time for. My mother took a sewing class and, with shaking fingers, completed a quilt that now hangs in my apartment like a stitched memory. I accepted some of Henry's offers and rejected others. I took a scholarship that allowed me to return to school and finish my nurse practitioner degree, but I refused an exalted title at one of his foundations because it felt like a gilded leash. We negotiated boundaries. Henry respected them, sometimes reluctantly. He was learning, in public and behind closed doors, how to be less in control of the narrative. There was a night, months into the reconstruction of our lives, when we all sat at my small kitchen table. The city hummed beyond my window, indifferent and electric. My parents looked smaller somehow, but not in the way that had defined my childhood. They were smaller because the act of shrinking had been unlearned. There was no grand reconciliation, just a meal of pasta and salad and a bottle of cheap red wine. "We should tell the truth," my father said abruptly, his voice low. "Not for Henry. Not for anyone but ourselves." We did. We spoke without the scaffolding of lawyers and publicists. We spoke of shame and of small joys and the quiet compromises that had sustained us. It wasn't clean. There were times when my voice trembled. There were times when my mother's hands shook as she tried to form phrases she had never allowed herself to say out loud. That evening left me with a sense of hard-earned lightness. The billionaire had knelt. He had offered money and apologies and sometimes a presence that bordered on intrusive. But the real change, the one that would last, was not his philanthropy. It was the slow, stubborn work of a family relearning how to be honest with each other, and a woman relearning how to accept care on her terms. If this story has touched something inside you, please share it. If you're comfortable, leave a comment. I'm reading every single one. It helps to know we're not alone. Years have a way of softening edges without smoothing the scar. My parents and I learned to walk with the history between us like a familiar weight. It did not vanish, but it no longer determined the rhythm of our steps. The Whitcomb name remained a presence in our lives, but it no longer defined us. Henry continued to be a complicated figure, sometimes generous, sometimes clumsy in his attempts at atonement. He met my requests for privacy with a restraint that sometimes faltered and sometimes surprised me. His son, Christopher, became less rigid and, on an unexpected afternoon, called my father to ask about a recipe that neither of them had ever thought their families might share. I finished my nurse practitioner program. The night I defended my final thesis, my parents sat in folding chairs in the back row of a university auditorium. People who had taught me the sharp lesson that sacrifice can be both unloving and generative. My father clapped like a man who had found new hands. My mother cried in the lobby afterward, wiping her eyes with the edge of her sleeve like one of the old ladies who watch over good things. You should know the billionaire never fixed everything. He could not. There were still things money could not stitch. The lost afternoons of my childhood, the time I had spent learning to make myself small. What he did do, in a way that mattered, was force conversations that otherwise might never have been had. He peeled back the varnish that had preserved our family's quiet reputation and made it possible for us to choose different scripts. There were also consequences I hadn't expected. People whispered, neighbors, extended family members, about the dinners and the speeches. Some accused us of cashing in on shame. Others offered pity. These judgments stung in ways I didn't always handle gracefully. There were nights I would awake with a cold panic, imagining that I had traded my dignity for a future my parents never could have imagined. It took time to realize that accepting help is not always a surrender. Sometimes it is a reallocation of resources toward possibility. Over the years, my relationship with my parents settled into something honest, sometimes tender, sometimes fault-line sharp. We quarrel still, about money, about old grievances. But we also share food and jokes and mince pies at holidays where we used to slide through the meal in practiced silence. My mother became the best cook of anyone I knew. Her hands finding old family recipes and riffing in ways that made our meals anther kind of map. My father, who had once said the world would take more if we gave it a reason, learned to stake a claim to small pleasures. A cheap cigar by the window, a new notebook for the poems he began to write in the margins of the city. As for Henry Whitcomb, his kneeling was not a singular moment that fixed everything. It was a hinge. He continued to do what he could, funding programs for the children of service workers, setting up trusts that ensured my parents would not outwork themselves into old age. But the most important thing he did was let the truth be said aloud. That power can wound without noticing, that privilege can be blind, and that sometimes the first step toward repair is humility. The most difficult lesson I carry now is this. People change in fits and starts. Sometimes the person you need to forgive most is yourself, for the years you blamed the wrong things or for the times you hid behind your own survival. Forgiveness is not erasure. It is a choice to stop letting the past determine the value of the present wholly. I learned to accept care without giving away my autonomy. I learned to ask for what I needed. I learned to say no. There is a peculiar tenderness I feel now when I walk past the Whitcomb building in the city. It is still a temple of power, its glass reflecting a skyline that never stops moving. But I walk with a certain steadiness not because of what was offered but because of what I earned. The right to be counted, to speak, to be heard. The billionaire knelt, yes. But his kneeling was nothing without the choices my parents made afterward, and the choices I made to insist on different things. To anyone listening who has been treated like less than human, you are not nothing. The world will try to teach you to be silent for your survival. Sometimes that strategy is necessary, but it need not be permanent. Find the people who will tell the truth with you. Ask for help but define its terms. Set boundaries against gestures that feel like currency for your dignity. Your story is yours to tell. It may not end how you expect. It will, however, be honest if you let it. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe. If you want to share your own experience, leave a comment. I'm reading every word. And if you're in a place where you feel like nothing, know this. The act of claiming yourself is revolutionary. The lessons linger. I learned that shame can be a cover for fear, that apology without action is hollow, and that power, when met with humility, can be redirected toward repair. My parents treated me like nothing for a long time, out of fear, weariness, and a system that rewarded obscurity. But when a billionaire knelt before me, he didn't transform us with a single gesture. What changed was that the truth could finally be named. From that naming came possibility. A different life, a stubborn hope, and a fragile, stubborn family that began, at last, to see each other.